What if Hollywood's golden boy wasn't exactly who fans thought he was? Troy Donahue, the beloved teen idol, known for his charming roles in romantic classics, seemed to have it all: fame, fortune, and adoration. Yet, beneath his carefully crafted image, Troy lived a secret double life, one hidden from fans and fiercely protected by the studios. Decades later, when he finally revealed the truth, the names he disclosed stunned everyone. Before the confessions, before the scandals, and long before the heartbreak, Troy Donahue was Hollywood's dream. With his golden blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and quiet, soft-spoken charm, he was every studio's fantasy and every teenage girl's crush. His rise to fame felt almost scripted, effortless, rapid, and blindingly bright. Born Merle Johnson Jr. in New York City, he was polished and educated, with a Columbia University background and a stage actress for a mother. But once he landed in Los Angeles, it didn't take long for Hollywood to transform him. Warner Brothers gave him a new name, Troy Donahue, and a clean-cut persona that would sell romance, innocence, and mid-century American values. His breakout came in 1959 with the film A Summer Place, opposite Sandra Dee. It was a runaway success. The story of forbidden young love, set against a backdrop of judgmental parents and coastal longing, resonated with a generation teetering on the edge of social revolution. But more than the plot, it was Donahue's presence, gentle, brooding, and magnetic, that lit up the screen. Almost overnight, he became a symbol. His image was splashed across fan magazines like Photoplay and Teen Beat. Girls wrote him letters by the thousands. Mothers approved of him. Studios protected him, and the world believed it. What they didn't know was that this image, the heartthrob, the wholesome romantic, the clean-cut golden boy, was a fabrication, carefully maintained by the same studios that made him famous. Every public appearance, every interview, every on-screen kiss was curated to preserve the illusion. Because if the truth came out, if the real Troy, with all his contradictions and private longings, was exposed, it could destroy everything. But for a while the mask held, and as Troy's fame reached its peak, so did the pressure to live a life that wasn't really his. At the height of his fame, Troy Donahue seemed untouchable. He was the ideal leading man, safe, handsome, emotionally restrained, and always polite. Studios adored him because he was marketable, and fans adored him because he represented a fantasy. But while audiences swooned over his on-screen romances, behind the scenes, Troy was struggling with a harsh reality. His entire career depended on a lie. Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s was more than just a dream factory. It was a machine. Studios didn't just manage actors' careers, they controlled their lives. Image was everything. If you were marketed as a heartthrob, you were expected to live like one, at least in the public eye. Troy was cast again and again as the ideal boyfriend. Thoughtful, noble, slightly mysterious, but always emotionally available. And that's exactly how Warner Brothers wanted him to appear in real life too. Executives arranged dates with starlets, fed stories to gossip columns, and ensured that Troy's public persona aligned with the roles he played. Even his wardrobe off-screen was selected to reinforce the image. But behind the polished smile and romantic roles, Troy was hiding a truth he couldn't afford to share. In private, he was quietly attracted to men, a reality that was absolutely forbidden in the Hollywood of his time. If word had gotten out, the fallout would have been immediate. His contracts would have been canceled. Magazines would have pulled his covers. His fan base, conditioned to adore a fantasy, would have vanished overnight. So Troy kept quiet. He played along, attending red carpet events with actresses he wasn't interested in, posing for beachside photo ops, and giving rehearsed interviews about his dream girl. It was a performance within a performance, one that took a toll on his spirit. Because while the world believed they were watching the real Troy Donahue, the man himself was slowly vanishing behind the mask. And as the roles piled up and his star continued to rise, so did the weight of the secret he carried. But eventually, all illusions begin to crack. By the mid-1960s, the world that once adored Troy Donahue began to turn its gaze elsewhere. Hollywood was changing, and fast. The clean-cut boy-next-door archetype was falling out of fashion. In its place came grittier stories, morally complex anti-heroes, and a generation of actors who reflected the turbulent culture of the Vietnam era. Troy, with his beach boy looks and polished demeanor, suddenly felt like a relic of a bygone time. Offers began to slow. Directors looked elsewhere. Audiences, once captivated by his gentle charm, were now more interested in the rebellious swagger of actors like Steve McQueen and Warren Beatty. And for Troy, who had built his entire public identity on an image carefully curated by others, there was no clear path forward. He was typecast, boxed in by a persona that no longer sold tickets. As the calls stopped coming, his personal life unraveled just as quickly. Without the constant reinforcement of public adoration and studio support, Troy was left with the one thing he'd spent years trying to escape: himself. The pressure of maintaining appearances for so long had quietly eaten away at his confidence. And now, with no roles, no spotlight, and no direction, he began to spiral. Alcohol became a crutch. So did denial. In interviews, he tried to appear unfazed, lighthearted even. But behind closed doors, things were far from glamorous. By the 1970s, Troy had fallen into a deep personal and financial crisis. There were times he was completely broke. At one point, he was homeless, living in his car in the very city where he once graced billboards and studio lots. For a man who had once been Hollywood's golden boy, the contrast was brutal. And yet, the most painful part wasn't the loss of fame. It was the years he spent lying about who he really was. The secret he carried through his entire rise to fame hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, now that the cameras were gone and the masks were no longer necessary, the truth weighed on him more than ever. But that truth was about to come out, and when it did, it would change everything we thought we knew about Troy Donahue. It wasn't until the 1990s, decades after his fame had faded, that Troy Donahue began to speak candidly about the parts of his life he had hidden for so long. And among his most startling revelations was the truth about his relationship with another Hollywood icon, Anthony Perkins. To the world, Anthony Perkins was best known for his haunting portrayal of Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. But behind that eerie intensity was a deeply private man, burdened by many of the same fears Troy carried. Both were rising stars in the 1950s. Both were under immense pressure to uphold carefully manufactured images, and both were secretly living lives that could have ended their careers if exposed. Troy later admitted that their connection wasn't casual. It was real, it was emotional, and it was dangerous. They had met at a private Hollywood party sometime in the late 50s, and the spark between them was immediate. But their circumstances demanded secrecy. "We could never go out in public together. We had to pretend, always pretend," Troy once recalled. Instead of public dates or holding hands at premieres, their time together was confined to quiet car rides along the California coast, or whispered conversations in the safe houses of close friends. There was a vulnerability to their relationship that couldn't survive the pressures of the world around them. Troy described Perkins as gentle and understanding, someone who knew exactly what it meant to live behind a mask. But that gentleness was constantly at war with fear. Fear of discovery, of humiliation, of being blacklisted. The threat wasn't just to their careers, but to their safety and livelihoods. It was a love that had to exist in the shadows, constantly hidden from view. There were no photographs, no love letters, no trace that the two icons had ever been anything more than acquaintances. That was the reality of the time. Studios wouldn't just fire you if you were exposed, they'd ruin you. Careers were destroyed overnight for less. Troy and Anthony's relationship eventually faded, not out of lack of emotion, but out of sheer exhaustion. The toll of pretending had simply become too great, and while they both continued on their own separate paths, the weight of what they had shared and lost remained etched in Troy's memory. But as painful as it was, this wasn't the only hidden chapter in Troy Donahue's love life. There was still another name he would reveal, one that shook fans even more. If Anthony Perkins was the quiet heartbreak of Troy Donahue's youth, then Rock Hudson was the impossible fantasy, the man who symbolized everything Troy was supposed to be and everything he could never have. In the golden age of Hollywood, Rock Hudson wasn't just a movie star. He was the embodiment of American masculinity. Towering, chiseled, impossibly handsome, and effortlessly charming, Hudson was the leading man all men wanted to be, and all women were told to want. But behind the camera, Rock, like Troy, was living a double life. One crafted by studio executives, fueled by carefully staged photo ops, and maintained through silence and fear. Troy never described their connection as a full-blown relationship the way he did with Perkins. Instead, he spoke of it as a series of fleeting, intimate moments, quiet acknowledgments, brief conversations, shared glances in rooms where no one else could understand what was being left unsaid. It wasn't a typical romance. It couldn't be. The stakes were too high. Rock had it harder than most of us, Troy once said in a hushed interview. He was bigger than life. If he slipped up, the whole house of cards would fall, and that was the truth. Hudson wasn't just famous, he was a brand. Universal Pictures had spent years grooming him into the perfect man. There was no room for mistakes, no space for vulnerability, and certainly no tolerance for the truth. But even legends crack under pressure. Troy recalled nights when they'd escaped together. No fanfare, no spotlight. Just two men sitting in a parked car near the beach, sharing silence, music, or the occasional burst of laughter. There were times, Troy said, just quiet, fleeting times where we shared something no one else could see. Their bond was born out of shared understanding. Two actors trapped in parallel prisons. Each knew the other's reality without explanation. They didn't have to talk about the fear of being exposed or the pain of watching their real selves erased by the machine around them. It was just understood. And perhaps that's why it hurt so much, because even in those brief stolen moments, they both knew it could never last. The pressure of pretending, day in and day out, was already crushing. Adding real feelings to the mix only made it more dangerous. So they drifted apart, not out of anger or betrayal, but out of survival. Both men returned to their lonely public roles, playing the part of heterosexual idols, giving interviews about their ideal women, and showing up on red carpets with the right date on their arm. Years later, when Rock Hudson's diagnosis and passing forced the world to finally confront the truth about Hollywood's toxic silence around identity, Troy reflected on it with a mixture of sorrow and respect. He never spoke about Hudson with regret, only empathy. "We were men who were supposed to be everything America dreamed of," he said, "and we were so afraid of losing it all." It was a quiet kind of grief, one that never made headlines, but lived in the space between what was and what could never be. And for Troy Donahue, it was just another chapter in a lifetime spent loving in the shadows. By the 1990s, Troy Donahue was no longer the fresh-faced idol he had once been. His star had faded, replaced by a more rugged and reflective man who had weathered decades of personal struggles and public obscurity. But with age came a certain freedom, a willingness to tell the truth about the life he had hidden for so long. Hollywood's grip on his image had loosened, and Troy no longer felt the need to play the role studios had assigned him decades earlier. It was during this time that Troy began to open up about his secret relationships, not in a sensational tell-all, but in quiet, reflective interviews that painted a portrait of a man who had lived through both glamour and heartbreak. He spoke with a sense of calm, even grace, about the years he spent hiding his authentic self, explaining how fear had shaped every move he made at the height of his fame. He didn't reveal these truths for shock value or attention. By the 1990s, Troy had nothing left to prove. Instead, his revelations felt like an act of liberation, a way to reclaim the parts of himself that Hollywood had forced him to bury. He talked openly about Anthony Perkins, describing him as both a kindred spirit and a victim of the same ruthless system that controlled him. He even acknowledged the connection he shared with Rock Hudson, not with scandal or bitterness, but with empathy for a man who bore an even heavier burden. Troy's honesty was refreshing, particularly in an era when discussions about LGBTQ identities were only just beginning to break through mainstream silence. For decades, actors like Donahue and Hudson had been forced to live double lives, their personal happiness sacrificed for the sake of maintaining an image. By speaking out, Troy wasn't just sharing his own story, he was giving a voice to an entire generation of performers who had suffered in silence. But the courage to tell the truth often comes from pain. Troy had spent years struggling with addiction, financial ruin, and the devastating loneliness that came from never fully living as himself. By the time he opened up, his life had already been shaped, and in some ways shattered, by the lies he was forced to tell. His reflections were tinged with both pride and regret. Pride for surviving, and regret for all the moments he never got to fully live. What made his revelation so powerful wasn't just the names he dropped, but the humanity behind them. He spoke about Perkins and Hudson not as icons, but as men who longed for connection, who feared being destroyed by their truth, and who, like him, were trapped in an industry built on illusion. But as Troy began to find peace in sharing his story, another battle was looming, one that would come not from Hollywood, but from his own failing body. Troy Donahue had lived through it all: meteoric fame, painful obscurity, 4 short-lived marriages, financial collapse, and a long battle with addiction. But by the late 1990s, something had shifted. He was no longer chasing stardom or hiding in shame. After years of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, personal reflection, and tentative steps back into the public eye through nostalgia conventions and guest TV appearances, Troy seemed at peace. He had survived the storm, and for the first time in his life, he was living honestly. He'd become a familiar face at fan conventions, not as a superstar, but as a survivor, warm, self-deprecating, and humble. Fans who once idolized the teenage heartthrob now found themselves drawn to the older, wiser version of Troy, a man who didn't pretend to have all the answers, who openly talked about his regrets, and who finally felt comfortable enough to stop performing off-camera. His late-in-life relationship with Jen Cao, a Chinese-American mezzo-soprano opera singer, offered him a rare kind of stability. It wasn't just a romantic bond. It was grounding, healing. Those close to him said she brought light to his later years. There were no Hollywood headlines, no photo ops, no calculated publicity, just companionship, peace, and quiet support. For a man who had lived much of his life in the shadow of a carefully constructed image, this final chapter was refreshingly real. But peace, as always, was fleeting. On August 30th, 2001, Troy suffered a massive heart attack at his Santa Monica apartment. He was rushed to St. John's Health Center, a hospital well known for treating the city's rich and famous. Doctors acted quickly, performing an emergency angioplasty. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might pull through. Friends were hopeful. But just hours later, Troy suffered a second, even more devastating heart attack. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and a more invasive coronary bypass surgery followed. This time, his body simply couldn't recover. On September 2nd, 2001, Troy Donahue passed away at the age of 65. He died surrounded by loved ones, not on a film set, not under a spotlight, but in the quiet presence of people who knew the real man behind the movie posters. The man who had once been America's golden boy. The man who had lost everything and found peace anyway. The man who, in the end, chose truth. Troy's death didn't dominate headlines. By then, many had forgotten the icon he once was. But for those who had followed his journey, and especially those who had lived lives hidden in plain sight, his story meant something more. It was a reminder that behind every carefully curated Hollywood image, there are real people living real lives, carrying secrets that no one ever sees. And for Troy Donahue, the truth he carried finally saw the light, just in time. Troy Donahue's story is more than a tale of fame lost and secrets kept. It's a window into a forgotten era of Hollywood, where image meant everything and truth had to be buried to survive. He was the ideal leading man of his time, the perfect product of a system that knew how to sell dreams, even if it meant breaking the people inside them. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the soft-focus romance films was a man who spent most of his life performing off-screen as much as on it. For decades, Troy carried the weight of a secret that could have ended his career, and maybe even his life. His relationships with Anthony Perkins and Rock Hudson weren't just romantic, they were acts of survival, hidden connections that gave him fleeting moments of authenticity in a world that demanded silence. He didn't speak out when he was at the height of his fame. He couldn't. But in his later years, when the stakes were no longer about box office numbers or public approval, he finally shared his truth, not to shock, but to heal. His quiet confessions gave voice to an entire generation of stars who had been forced to love in the shadows. And while Hollywood has changed in many ways, Troy's story still resonates, because it reminds us that the people we idolize on screen are human, flawed, vulnerable, and sometimes deeply wounded. And sometimes, the most powerful part of a legacy isn't the roles they played, but the courage it took to stop pretending. If you found this story moving, you'll definitely want to check out our video on 20 secretly gay celebrities, From Vintage Hollywood, it dives even deeper into the hidden lives of stars who, like Troy, lived with the fear of being exposed in an unforgiving era. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten Hollywood tales.